Husband left me for my mom, then came crawling back when he found out she didn't inherit anything and I got it all. Hi, I'm in a pickle right now because of my deranged mother and equally foolish soon-to-be ex-husband, who have teamed up to completely ruin my peace of mind out of sheer greed. I wish I could talk about this with my friends, but it feels way too personal and embarrassing to share with anyone I know in real life. Trust me, you'll understand why I say this once I tell you what I'm going through. I don't have much family to speak of, so I can't exactly turn to anyone else either. That's why I'm here, turning to the Reddit community, mainly to vent and get this off my chest, but also to make sure I'm not the bad guy in this situation, despite how they're trying to make me feel. This all started just 2 weeks ago when, out of absolutely nowhere, my husband of 3 years, let's call him Kevin, told me he wanted to break up because he developed feelings for my mom. Yes, you read that right, and no, this isn't a joke. Believe me, I was as stunned as you likely are right now, and 100 times more disgusted when he confessed. He told me that he'd been having an affair with her for 3 months, and I had no clue because I'd been busy with work and he hadn't behaved in a way that would have raised suspicion. For context, I'm 27 and my mother is 47. She had me while she was in college, but my dad was never in the picture. When my mom told him she was pregnant, he not only broke up with her but also tried to pressure her into terminating the pregnancy. She refused because she saw it as an excuse to drop out of college, and she decided to have me. My grandparents were wealthy enough to let her make that choice, but they weren't happy with her decision. They tried to push her to go back to school after I was born, but she refused. Instead, my mom dabbled in a bunch of professions before finally settling on interior decoration. She's not an interior designer. She doesn't create designs, but more of a consultant who advises rich people on where to place furniture and how to decorate their rooms for visual appeal. It's a niche service for affluent folks, and she's fairly good at it. Not because of any qualifications, she doesn't have any, but because my grandfather was a well-known realtor who got her work through his connections. Growing up, my mom was the most unreliable and flaky person I'd ever met, and she was incredibly lucky to be born into a wealthy family because otherwise she would have ended up on the streets. My grandparents practically raised me because my mother was too busy being a social butterfly. As a kid, I honestly thought my grandparents were my biological parents and my mother was an older sister. By the time I reached my teenage years, I had given up on my mother completely. She was just as carefree as ever, with no sense of responsibility. My grandfather passed away when I was in 7th grade, and it was just me and my grandmother after that. My mother was more of a burden than a family member. For example, at 15, I had to explain to her why it wasn't a good idea to fly to Iceland with a man she'd met on Tinder 2 days earlier. That's the kind of person she is. My grandmother always told me that once she passed, I'd be on my own because my mother was unreliable and would never help me. With that in mind, I worked incredibly hard to build a stable, independent life. Today, I'm the COO of a successful company, earning twice as much as Kevin, who is the head of sales at a smaller firm. I never judged him for earning less or made him feel inferior. My grandmother had taught me to be humble, even though I graduated from one of the top business schools in the state and interned at the company where I now hold a leadership role. I met Kevin at a mutual friend's birthday party 5 years ago. We hit it off immediately, bonded over shared interests, and started dating. After 2 years, he proposed, and I didn't hesitate to say yes. At the time, I believed he was a good man, loyal and trustworthy. Clearly, I was wrong. Kevin would occasionally joke about how my mom was hot and could pass for my sister. While I didn't appreciate the comments, I brushed them off, thinking they were harmless. No one expects this kind of betrayal to actually happen. My relationship with my mom had always been strained, but I kept in touch with her out of a sense of obligation to my grandmother. Gran was a kind and loving woman who never gave up on her daughter, no matter how difficult she was. Even after Gran passed away last year, I still tried to maintain some connection with my mom, more to honor Gran's memory than because I wanted to. That all ended 2 weeks ago when Kevin dropped his bombshell. I had just returned home from a business trip when he sat me down and, with a completely straight face, confessed that he was in love with my mother. He claimed they wanted to be together. At first, I thought it was some kind of twisted joke and laughed, but he didn't laugh back. Instead, he went on to explain how he and my mother had been sneaking around for 3 months. He detailed how their affair began. My mother had texted him, asking for help fixing her headphones. From there, their conversations escalated, eventually turning into something more. He admitted that he didn't mean for it to go this far, but he couldn't help himself. He even said that my mother reminded him of me, which made me feel physically sick. I kicked him out of the house that night, and he didn't put up much of a fight. He knew he could just move in with my mother. That night, I cried until I had no tears left. Around 4:30 in the morning, fueled by wine and anger, I sent my mother a furious text. I called her every name in the book and accused her of being a terrible daughter to Gran, a horrible mother to me, and just an all-around awful person. I told her that once her looks faded, Kevin would leave her, too, and she'd end up alone. To my surprise, my mother responded. Her text was filled with arrogance. She claimed that even if her beauty faded, her bank account never would, and she bragged about the inheritance she was expecting from Gran. That's when it hit me. I'd completely forgotten about the will. When Gran passed, her lawyer informed us that we'd find out what she left us after the probate period, which would take about 6 to 9 months. Neither my mother nor I had any idea what to expect, but my mother was clearly banking on a massive inheritance. After reading my mother's smug response, I decided not to engage further. Instead, I reached out to my lawyer the next day and began the divorce process. Within a week, Kevin had been served. I thought that would be the end of it, but fate had other plans. Just 5 days ago, I received a call from Gran's lawyer. I'd requested that the inheritance details be shared with us separately because I couldn't bear to be in the same room as my mother or Kevin. When the lawyer informed me of the contents of the will, I was in shock and pure delight. Gran had left me everything: her money, assets, and properties. My mother, on the other hand, inherited only a diamond ring and matching earrings that Gran used to wear. Gran's reasoning was simple. She'd supported my mother her entire life, and now it was time for her to stand on her own. It was poetic justice. My mother, who had relied on Gran for everything, was left with almost nothing. Meanwhile, Gran had ensured my independence, even though she'd always told me I'd be on my own after her passing. The day after I learned about the inheritance, Kevin texted me. His message was a poorly veiled attempt to worm his way back into my life. He claimed he had made a huge mistake and wanted to reconcile. He wrote about how he had realized my mother wasn't what he thought she was, and how he had been blinded by a momentary lapse in judgment. He even had the audacity to say he now understood how much I meant to him and wanted to give our marriage a second chance. It was clear he had no idea that I already knew about my grandmother's will. He probably thought my mother was set to inherit a fortune, and when he discovered she'd received almost nothing, he must have panicked. I didn't reply immediately. I spent the entire day deciding how to respond, debating whether to confront him or ignore him. In the end, I settled on something simple. I replied with a single clown emoji and immediately blocked his number. But I wasn't done yet. I took a screenshot of his pathetic text and sent it to my mother with 3 clown emojis. Then I turned off my phone and spent the rest of the evening watching Netflix, ignoring the chaos I knew I had unleashed. The next morning, I heard about the fallout. My mom's next-door neighbor, whose daughter is a friend of mine, filled me in on the details. According to her, my mother and Kevin had a massive fight the night before. It began with yelling that escalated into a full-blown screaming match. My mother, in her rage, physically threw Kevin out of the house, literally. He was lying on the pavement outside her home, bleeding from a gash on his forehead after she threw a hardcover book at him. The neighbor told me that the scene was so loud and chaotic that several other neighbors came out to see what was happening. Kevin ended up pressing charges against my mother for assault. Although it was classified as a misdemeanor and she only had to pay a fine, the incident was serious enough to leave Kevin with stitches and a bruised ego. Of course, my mother blamed me for everything. She sent a barrage of texts from a secondary number, calling me all sorts of names and accusing me of ruining her relationship. I ignored her messages, but the guilt started creeping in. I didn't feel bad for Kevin. He deserved whatever he got, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I might have taken things too far by sending my mother that screenshot. After reading through the comments on my original post and reflecting on everything that had happened, I realized I didn't owe either of them any guilt or regret. They destroyed my marriage and betrayed me in the worst possible way. All I did was expose their toxicity to each other. If my mother resorted to physical violence, that's on her, not me. Kevin's injury was unfortunate, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sympathy for someone who cheated on me with my own mother. As for my mother, her behavior was nothing short of unhinged. I decided that the best course of action was to cut both of them out of my life entirely. I blocked my mother on every platform I could think of, even PayPal, and began the process of filing a restraining order. A week after Kevin was served with the divorce papers, my mother decided to escalate things. She showed up at my house uninvited, waiting for me in the front yard. When I arrived home from work, she refused to leave and demanded that I share the inheritance with her. Her reasoning? Gran was her mother, and she deserved her fair share. I laughed in her face and told her she was delusional if she thought I was giving her anything. When she started walking toward my car, I immediately rolled up the windows. She then kicked the passenger door, leaving a visible dent. I photographed the damage and later discovered it had all been caught on my home's security cameras. That was the final straw. I contacted my lawyer and officially filed for a restraining order against her. Unfortunately, my attempts to file a police report hit a roadblock because my mother has connections to the local DA's office. However, I'm confident that the security footage will help my case in court. As of now, my divorce proceedings with Kevin are ongoing. He isn't contesting the divorce, which makes things easier, but he and his lawyer have been trying to twist the narrative in his favor during settlement negotiations. I've been gathering evidence of his infidelity to ensure that the truth comes out. On the brighter side, therapy has been immensely helpful. It's teaching me how to process my anger and move forward without letting this experience define me. I'm determined to build a life free from the toxic influence of both Kevin and my mother. Gran's decision to leave everything to me wasn't just an act of kindness, it was her final gift of freedom. For that, I'll always be grateful.